Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, and thank you for joining us. Before we begin, I would like to set expectation on today's webinar content. We are happy to have you along for the journey, and we also recognize the importance of context to applicability. It's part of what makes our product great. There are going to be technical concepts and terminology ahead, and we'll also be digging into specifics that are nuanced. In that spirit, if you are not currently an Automox customer, you might learn something today, but I'd encourage you to speak with our sales team first, as this webinar is geared more towards new or existing customers in expansion. As with all of our webinars, we'd like to quickly address housekeeping for today's session. We are using a new platform called On24. This is different from our previous webinar platform. So for some helpful tips, there's a slide view window, which is the primary viewing pane for our session. You can customize this window sizing as you see fit. The Q&A box is located in the lower right-hand corner of the window. This is where you'll submit any questions you might have today. With the exception of technical difficulties, any live demonstrations create a separate window. You can manually open or close that screen by clicking the play button icon in the lower menu. All of the webinar participants who are not presenting will be muted, and questions will be addressed during the webinar. So putting a face with a voice, my name is Nicholas Collier, and I am a Senior Product Marketing Manager here at Automox. It is my distinct pleasure to be introducing my counterpart for today's webinar, and one of my favorite people here at Automox, David McCluskey. David is on our customer success team and joins us today to cover key onboarding tips, tricks, and more customer success drivers when adopting the Automox platform. So without further ado, take it away, David.
Thanks, Nick. So today we wanted to talk about how you would manage your devices when you're moving from on-prem solutions to a cloud-based solution. A lot of customers are challenged with moving from an on-prem solution where you've blocked most of the internet where it's not needed for work to using the internet specifically to manage your devices. So what we'd like to talk to today is how you can configure your agents to communicate correctly, how to modify firewalls and proxy configurations to allow your devices to communicate so that they can be managed appropriately from the cloud. Okay, so one of the biggest things to manage your devices is making sure that your devices can communicate to that points on the internet so that they could be managed. The first part is actually the agent itself and accessing your console. So we have a few different locations on the internet your devices will need to be able to communicate openly. Any device that runs the console will need to be able to access console.automox.com. This works for several different components, but any sort of browser administration does need access here. The agents don't specifically need access. For the agent functionality, we have two different endpoints that your agent will need access to. The primary is the api.automox.com. This is an absolute requirement. The second one is if you're using any sort of worklet or you upload content into a worklet or a required software policy. Content is stored here, so that will be needed if you want to pull that content back down. And again, if you're running a console from internally from your environment and you're uploading content, you'll also need access to the S3 location as well. Many of our customers ask which browsers they need to run the console. So the best browsers are going to be Chrome, Edge, and Firefox, which are evergreen solutions. Our support includes the newest version all the time. And then we also support Safari at current or current version -1. Just a side note, we don't currently support the mobile versions. It's the full browser version. So hopefully that helps with the console access. The next section is covering OS patch source. So the most common locations for us to patch are from our vendor sites, such as the downloadwindowsupdate.com for Microsoft updates, and also Apple. Those are the two biggest. Linux repositories are local lists on your devices. Access to any path that's in that repository is also needed. So as we've listed here are some examples. We do have a complete list of the patch sources on our blog. So I suggest you look at the support pages in the blogs to get a full list. These are examples. If you don't allow these, and a lot of these are blocked by many of our customers before they change to an internet-based solution from on-prem, the updates will not be able to be detected, and then you'll get a skewed number or no updates relevant to your device. And then the other problem, lots of times the patches won't download correctly. So these are the number one and number two problems: is access for the agent to communicate and access to your source updates. Finally, we've listed a few more paths that are of interest to open up. If you're updating Chrome, the Chrome updater is used. So any source that Google has defined for the Chrome updater need to be accessed. Office 365 has different update source points, which are also included in our firewall and whitelisting rules as a link to Microsoft site. Those are separate from the Windows updates. Adobe updates, depending on your application, they can also come from Adobe directly, Firefox as well. There are other places that content can be stored and reached. So I did list WSUS and peer caching solutions as far as delivery optimization or peer caching from Apple. So all these sources are needed for this to function correctly. So now that we've covered access to endpoints on the internet for management, we wanted to discuss the agent management and functionality. A lot of tools our customers use are security applications ensuring that processes are not running that aren't controlled. This section is how to make sure that Automox is trusted and allowed to control what it needs to patch and install software in your devices. So the first section is firewall and proxy. We did cover most of the firewall configurations, and we do have documentation as well for both proxy and firewall. We also do have a script, which is in our documentation, which is connected to the WebEx documentation today, which gives a script for Linux to configure the proxy appropriately. So please do take a look at the notes because I've added lots of context for our new customers. Main points here. You'll want to whitelist all the needed URLs. Microsoft's done a great job, and Apple's done a great job of defining each of the locations and the URLs. If you do need to define IP addresses, we've defined in our documentation a way that you can identify them. I do suggest not using IPs because they do change so often. So please consider that as you're setting this up. Another part of the proxy configuration, and now it's actually enforced by Microsoft, is allowing the device or system to have access via the proxy to the patch source. And this is a key difference between traditional configuration where a user has access through a proxy and a device now is managing your patching management directly. So it's important that you're configuring access by your device. So it needs to be direct and silent through your proxy configuration, and your device needs to have access, and it needs to also have routing through your environment out to the internet. The second part is EPP trust. What we want to do is ensure that your antivirus software, your critical security applications are trusting Automox agents. There are configurations and documentation included in the notes that can direct you to each of our different vendors that we have documented so far on how to configure that trust. Look at that because it will help and save issues where the agent might not be able to complete its actions and it might be frozen, or it might not be allowed to download content appropriately. The last part is agent and script execution. So we have specific locations per operating system where we install our agents. We suggest that either through trust configurations or through approval and whitelisting directories, that you're allowing these processes and executables to run correctly. We have a separate directory where scripts are run from. So this is where we'll create temporary directory, download content and script, and then run from there for Automox to function correctly. If the trust isn't configured or the whitelisting is not applied correctly, the scripts could be blocked. So that's a number 2 or 3 problem that we see. If needed, you can change the custom worklet temp directories and where that script set will be downloaded to a location that you prefer on your devices. So I wanted to cover again the primary problems we're seeing with on-prem to cloud management migrations. The first, again, is your proxy and firewall configurations. You need to ensure that your devices have the needed access to be managed from the cloud. This can include routing. Agent functionality is the second component. You need to ensure all of your security apps and configurations allow Automox to do its job. If needed, configure your trust items, configure your whitelisting, and ensure that your scripts are trusted and can run. That includes processes, executable. The agent runs its own service. So for each of your tools, you'll need to consider Automox and its trust. The agent requirements are also something to consider. We have specific versions of Linux that are supported. Please look at our requirements and supported versions. If you're running Windows, you'll want to make sure that you have .NET 3.5 or later and PowerShell 2 or later. Final requirement at this time is an x86 or x64 based processor. ARM isn't fully supported at this time. M1 will be shortly. So what's next? Now that we've ensured we have access for our agents to communicate to the cloud where we're now managed, and we know that the agent can function correctly, the next section is our most asked questions on how to manage a device. So OS source assignment is pretty straightforward. You're going to be using as a source Windows updates or a WSUS server for Windows. Apple will have its locations and paths on the internet, and Linux is based on its repository list. Third-party updates are managed and they're actually stored in the console. So again, that needs to be whitelisted for both the console access and also for content downloads. And finally, there's a couple of other paths that are listed in the slide before this one for direct support for Chrome, Firefox, and sometimes Adobe. The next major problem that we see and are talking through with our customers to help with is the migration plan for moving from a previous solution. So as an example, there are other solutions that might use WSUS server. And to configure those devices to point at the previous WSUS server, there might be a group policy or another tool with an agent that's defining where it's looking at with its updates. So what you'll need to do is define a migration plan where you're changing from your old agent to your new agent. So review your group policies, review your current tool set, and identify how it's configuring its Windows Update configurations. If they're overlapping, they could reassign the settings and configurations on top of each other each time they run a policy update. This can cause issues with reporting, patches installing at unknown times, unspecified and unexpected restarts. So making a plan and ensuring you're following that plan during your migration is key. Group structure is also important. You want to define how you want your devices assigned into groups so that you can ensure your policies run when they're expected. Groups in Automox are a 1-to-1 ratio, meaning one device per one group at this time. So you want to define your groups on a way that you can define your policy schedule times as well. You can assign per group as many policies as you like, but the schedule is assigned to a policy. So if a policy is assigned to your group, it will run everything at that time. There are times where you might not want your patch policy to run on the same day for all your devices. That's an example of when you'll want to modify your group structure to handle maybe a pilot and a production stage where you can have different policies assigned. Next, you'll want to look at your patch policy logic. Which patches do you want to include? Are there specific groups where you want to have different policies? You'll want to look at schedules. As mentioned, a schedule is connected to a policy. So that determines the time. If you'd like to have the same policy run on different groups at different times, that's a group structure and a patch policy logic decision. Schedules, you'll want to define those. They can run up to daily and as far as once per year. So figure out your schedule, and then targeting. Again, you can assign a policy to as many groups as you like, but how do you want that policy schedule to run? The next step, how do I install my agents? And how do I organize my devices? So we do have lots of documentation. Again, I urge you to look at the documentation that's included with the WebEx. We have lots of resources on how to run this through bulk installations and configurations to put your device directly into a group when you're installing agents. Next, reboot strategy. Reboot strategy is important as most users aren't fans of restarts. They are required. So reboot strategy, you might want to look at your policies again and the logic defined. Are you wanting to include a reboot and notifications with the policy? Great, we have that built into the policies. If you'd like to separate them, we have worklets in our community that can help with reboots on a schedule. Just please note that reboots are a large requirement with applying patches and ensuring security. The next and last item before you're up and running as a start is how do you ensure that your patches are installed? So looking at your patch policy logic, you'll understand which patches you're intending to install, and your schedule will define when. We have a pre-patch report that's very helpful with looking at which patches are still needed, and running those specific schedules on your audit when you run those reports can help you define which patches are still needed, which patches were applied. All this together will help you ensure that you have a plan and you know what's happening. Finally, we have resources. I've listed several of these here, and again, they're in the notes. We have several different types of videos, walkthroughs. So I do urge you to look at these resources, and here's my favorite list of places to find them here.
Awesome, David. Thank you so much for taking us through, the evolution of the onboarding and adoption process for the product. To me, my biggest takeaway that I have, aside from kind of the more technical and tactical elements that we've gone over, is also just the importance of the practices in implementing the content. I think before we wrap, I do want to address a few questions, and I do see some here in the Q&A. The first one, you mentioned third-party updates. Where can I see a list of Automox third-party supported patches?
I suggest looking at support.automox.com. And on the left side, you'll find links on how to manage your agents. So there is a list of third-party updates that are supported. They list out each of the applications that are supported, and they list out which operating systems they're supported on. We also include a document on third-party updates on how they're handled, as far as if they're running or not running during the time of patching, and what they'll do with restarts of the application. Just a side note on this is a consideration if you use lots of the third-party applications. It may require a second policy to apply updates if you want to separate them. The reason why is if you look at the list that is provided there, some of the applications, they won't run the patch process if they're already running the application. So you might want a notification to your end users that the application's running, or you might want to send a notification to end that process before your patch policy runs. Finally, we do have one more document. It lists the third-party updates. And this is a kind of one of those nuances that's great to know. There is a document that defines a naming structure. So if you use required applications, most of the time when you upload your file MSIs and specific other files will provide back your application name and the version. We do have a standardized naming structure, so referring to that document will help ensure that your compliance state is there. We'll give you the name and what it should actually be stated as, so that it can ensure that it shows compliance and that it patches.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that detailed answer, David. We do have another couple of questions here. Is PowerShell 2.0 installed by default on Windows 10?
So PowerShell 2 is not, but it's 2 or newer. So as long as you have Windows 10, you have a current PowerShell version. For Windows 7, you'll need to make sure that you have the right .NET version and the right PowerShell version. And unless you're pre-SP1 on Windows 7, you should be able to have that automatically. .NET 3.5 is something that you want to check for 7 and 8.1 for Windows, or the same server versions that match those. But version 10 comes with the appropriate .NET and PowerShell versions that are required.
Great. It looks like we've got time for one last question. Is the community page the best place to ask about worklets?
I think it is, absolutely. There's several different people that are on every single day. There's always someone that's willing to answer a question. Myself and several people in the community that love answering questions and providing examples of worklets. That's definitely the place to go.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, David. We really appreciate your time today, and thank you for sharing these link resources. Just as a reminder to everyone who's with us today, that list is within the frame of On24 platform, so you should see that within the sidebar. Please make reference to it, save it, check it out, and then also make use of the community. You know, there's a tremendous wealth of information about different tips and tricks and practice that, you know, you may find that are industry specific in nature. So definitely check that out. With that, I think that'll wrap our presentation for today. I want to thank everyone for joining us, and Automox on.